At exactly 4 o'clock a.m., the United States made a decision that could have triggered World War III. And what happened next shocked the entire world. Inside the subterranean, highly classified confines of the White House Situation Room, the air was suffocatingly heavy. The President of the United States, surrounded by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Directors of National Intelligence, stared at a massive digital map illuminated in an ominous crimson glow. The DEFCON level had just been quietly lowered to level 2, the highest state of nuclear readiness short of actual global thermonuclear war. The crisis had not been broadcast on global news networks. There were no panicked anchors, no scrolling tickers, and no public alarms. The civilian world was entirely asleep, blissfully unaware that humanity was currently balancing on the razor-thin edge of the abyss. A rogue, highly militarized, near-peer adversary had just initiated the irreversible launch sequence of a next-generation, intercontinental, hypersonic glide vehicle. But this weapon was not aimed at a city. It was aimed squarely at the USS Ronald Reagan, a forward-deployed American nuclear-powered supercarrier operating in the open waters of the Pacific. The intelligence was absolute. The adversary believed that decapitating the flagship of the United States Pacific Fleet would instantly paralyze American power projection, forcing a humiliating retreat from the region. It was the ultimate gamble. But at exactly 400 hours, the United States did not retreat. They did not open diplomatic back channels. They executed a masterclass in overwhelming, preemptive, multi-domain warfare that completely redefined the global balance of power in less than 45 minutes. To truly comprehend the sheer gravity of what was unleashed that morning, you have to understand the terrifying mathematics of hypersonic warfare. For decades, the United States Navy relied on the immense distance of the open ocean as its primary shield. Traditional ballistic missiles follow a predictable, parabolic arch, much like a thrown baseball. Because their trajectory is predictable, American Aegis combat systems can calculate exact intercept points minutes in advance. But a hypersonic glide vehicle breaks every single rule of traditional orbital mechanics. Launched atop a conventional ballistic missile booster, the weapon separates in the upper atmosphere, but instead of entering the vacuum of space, it violently pitches down. It surfs the very edge of the Earth's atmosphere at speeds exceeding Mach 15, or roughly 11,000 miles per hour. At this unimaginable velocity, the friction of the air molecules literally rips electrons from their atoms, encasing the weapon in a superheated plasma sheath. This plasma bubble acts as a cloaking device, absorbing and deflecting traditional radio waves, making the weapon virtually invisible to standard early warning radars. Furthermore, it does not fly in a straight line. It is highly maneuverable, capable of executing violent, unpredictable turns at thousands of miles per hour, bleeding off energy to evade interceptors. If a weapon like this impacts an aircraft carrier, it does not even need a high-explosive warhead. The sheer kinetic energy of a titanium wedge striking the flight deck at Mach 15 is equivalent to a tactical nuclear detonation. It would instantly vaporize the ship, sending 100,000 tons of American sovereign territory and 5,000 sailors to the bottom of the ocean in a fraction of a second. When the United States Space Force's space-based infrared system satellites detected the massive thermal bloom of the adversary's booster rocket igniting on the launch pad thousands of miles away, the countdown to midnight began. The time to impact was calculated at exactly 22 minutes. The president had only seconds to authorize a response. The doctrine of proportionate response was instantly discarded. The order given was Operation Midnight Anvil. The objective was not merely to intercept the incoming hypersonic threat, but to simultaneously, violently, and completely eradicate the adversary's entire strategic launch capability, their command and control infrastructure, and their naval assets, before a second shot could ever be fired. The American response did not begin with a kinetic explosion. It began in the absolute silence of the electromagnetic spectrum. At exactly 4:01 a.m., United States Cyber Command unleashed the most sophisticated, highly classified cyber weapon ever deployed in human history. This was a zero-day exploit that had been secretly embedded deep within the adversary's air-gapped military networks for years, waiting dormant for this exact moment. With a single keystroke in Fort Meade, Maryland, a digital plague washed over the enemy's infrastructure. Across the adversary's mainland, early warning radar arrays suddenly froze, displaying nothing but blank static. Their encrypted military communication satellites were forcefully overridden, flooded with high-decibel, agonizing white noise. The automated launch sequencers for their remaining missile silos were bricked, locking massive steel doors shut and trapping the weapons inside. The enemy commanders, who moments ago believed they were initiating a masterstroke of naval warfare, suddenly found themselves completely blind, deaf, and paralyzed in the dark. With the enemy's electronic eyes gouged out, the United States initiated the physical devastation. Deep beneath the cold waters of the Pacific Ocean, hundreds of miles off the adversary's coastline, a massive shadow stirred. An Ohio-class guided missile submarine, a silent leviathan carrying more conventional firepower than most entire nations, received the encrypted flash action message. The submarine did not surface. Instead, hovering perfectly still at a depth of 150 feet, the massive steel hatches on its dorsal hull snapped open. In a display of terrifying, rapid-fire mechanical precision, the submarine Ripple fired an overwhelming volley of 154 Tomahawk Block 5 land attack cruise missiles. The missiles violently breached the surface of the ocean in explosive geysers of seawater, their solid rocket boosters igniting with a deafening roar that tore the quiet night apart. As soon as they achieved altitude, their turbofan engines took over, and their wings snapped into place. The swarm of 154 missiles immediately dropped down to an altitude of barely 50 feet above the waves, flying in a tightly coordinated, autonomous swarm, completely invisible to what little radar the enemy had left. But the Tomahawks were only the first wave, high above the cloud layer, flying directly from the continental United States, with the aid of multiple mid-air refuelings, was the absolute pinnacle of American aerospace engineering, a flight of B-21 Raider stealth bombers. Making their first ever unclassified combat debut, these heavily classified bat-winged aircraft possess a radar cross-section the size of a mosquito. They slipped into the adversary's heavily contested airspace completely undetected, completely bypassing the advanced S-400 surface to air missile batteries that were supposed to create an impenetrable fortress. The Raiders were carrying the heaviest conventional weapon on Earth, the 30,000-pound GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator. As the bombers silently passed over the adversary's subterranean strategic command bunkers, which were buried under hundreds of feet of solid mountain granite, their payload doors snapped open. While the retaliatory strike package was inbound, the USS Ronald Reagan and its escorting carrier strike group were fighting a desperate battle for their very survival. The hypersonic glide vehicle had separated from its booster and was now skipping across the upper atmosphere, glowing cherry red as it descended toward the fleet at over Mach 10. Inside the Combat Information Center of the lead Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, the tension was suffocating. Traditional radar was struggling to paint a consistent track on the plasma-encased weapon. But the United States Navy had not been ignoring the hypersonic threat. They had been quietly upgrading the Aegis Baseline 9 combat system with advanced, decentralized tracking algorithms. The destroyer was linked directly to low Earth orbit satellite tracking layers, feeding raw telemetry directly into the ship's fire control computers. The tactical action officer watched the terrifying geometry of the engagement play out on the massive blue screens. The window for interception was measured in single-digit seconds. As the hypersonic vehicle plunged into its final terminal dive, aiming directly for the flight deck of the supercarrier, the destroyer fired its absolute best weapon. An SM-3 Block 2A interceptor roared out of the vertical launch system. This is not a missile designed to explode near a target to destroy it with shrapnel. This is a hit-to-kill kinetic vehicle. It is designed to navigate into the vacuum of space, acquire a target traveling at thousands of miles per hour, and physically collide with it. The SM-3 accelerated out of the atmosphere, shedding its booster stages until only the lethal kinetic kill vehicle remained. Miles above the surface of the ocean, moving at a combined closure rate of nearly 20,000 miles per hour, American engineering met the hypersonic nightmare. There was no explosion. There was only a blinding, instantaneous flash of kinetic energy as the American interceptor struck the hypersonic glide vehicle dead center. The massive force of the impact instantly vaporized the titanium wedge into a cloud of harmless, microscopic dust that harmlessly scattered across the upper atmosphere. The multi-billion-dollar American shield had held. The carrier was safe. Not a single sailor had been lost. At the exact same moment that the hypersonic threat was erased from the sky, the American counterattack arrived at its targets. The swarm of 154 Tomahawk cruise missiles struck the adversary's coastal naval bases, submarine pens, and surface-to-air missile sites with devastating pinpoint accuracy. Anti-aircraft batteries were blown to pieces. Frigates and destroyers tied to their piers were engulfed in massive fireballs as the 1,000-pound warheads detonated deep within their hulls. And high up in the mountains, the B-21 Raiders delivered the killing blow. The massive ordnance penetrators struck the earth with the force of localized earthquakes. The hardened steel casings drove hundreds of feet through solid rock before detonating. The subterranean shockwaves pulverized the adversary's underground missile silos, collapsing the launch tubes and sympathetically detonating the stored rocket fuel. Entire mountain peaks visibly shuddered and vented massive plumes of smoke and fire as the underground complexes were completely hollowed out. By 4:45 a.m., less than 45 minutes after the crisis had begun, it was completely over. The United States military had not just defended its aircraft carrier. It had surgically and completely removed the adversary's ability to ever project strategic force beyond its own borders again. Their navy was burning in its home ports. Their intercontinental ballistic missile infrastructure was buried under millions of tons of collapsed granite. Their communication networks were hopelessly corrupted by malicious American code, and most importantly, all of this had been accomplished without the use of a single nuclear weapon. It was the most dominant, overwhelming display of conventional military supremacy in recorded human history. When the sun rose and the civilian world finally awoke, the international community was plunged into a state of absolute, paralyzed shock. The geopolitical landscape had been fundamentally violently restructured while they slept. Allied nations stared in awe at the unbridled capability of the American military apparatus, realizing that the protective umbrella of the United States was far more technologically advanced than anyone had ever theorized. But for the remaining near-peer adversaries around the globe, the morning brought only cold, undeniable terror. They looked at the satellite imagery of the smoldering, pulverized mountain fortresses. They analyzed the telemetry data of the intercepted hypersonic weapon, a weapon they had spent billions developing, believing it was the ultimate carrier killer. They realized that their assumptions were fatally flawed. The United States did not just possess the ability to survive a first strike. The United States possessed the completely integrated, multi-domain capability to detect the threat, intercept the unstoppable, and completely annihilate the origin of the attack before the sun even came up. The message echoing across the capitals of the world was deafening. The era of testing American resolve with advanced weaponry had ended. At exactly 400 hours, the United States drew a line in the sand with precision-guided fire and unequivocally reminded the planet why it remains the undisputed, unipolar military hegemon of the modern world.